Hello history buffs. In this video we're going to talk about a fascinating lady, Agnes Sampson. Now you may not have heard of Agnes, but you will have heard about the king she met and had a huge influence on, and that was James the First of England and Sixth of Scotland, famous for the King James Bible of course, and also for nearly being blown up in the gunpowder plot. So, why was Agnes so important in James's story? Well, Agnes was accused not only of being a witch, but of being the elder witch in the North Berwick witch trials, and actually, she convinced James that witches existed and they were out to get him. Why on earth did she do this when it was likely to get her killed? Well, we're going to find out in this video. Now, we need to understand a few things about Agnes's world and times before we can understand how this all came about. When we hear the word witch, or we think of witch trials or witch hunts, we think of the medieval period, and actually all this happened a long time after the medieval period. The medieval period in England ends in 1485 when, of course, Henry Tudor defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Fields and brings in the Tudor dynasty. Then we have the English Renaissance, and we're even beyond the Tudor times by the time Agnes starts to appear in history. The year is 1591. So at this point, James is King of Scotland. He hasn't quite yet become King of England. That won't happen until Elizabeth I dies in 1603. But we've had a century away from the medieval period, and also we've had something called the Reformation, a change in religious thinking that swept Europe, and then, of course, Henry VIII used it to his own advantage in England when he wished to get rid of his wife Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn in the hopes of having an heir. And we all know all that. How is this in any way relevant to Agnes's story? Well, a few things kind of came with the Reformation. For example, Martin Luther, whose 95 Theses basically kicked off the Reformation in 1517, under his influence, the German peasants eventually revolted, and sort of a subversion of the accepted hierarchy came with the Reformation, because people who before would have had the Bible explained to them by a priest and weren't able to sort of think about other ways of thinking, suddenly were empowered by the newfangled invention of the printing press. When I say newfangled, the Gutenberg press in Europe was only the first printing press in Europe. The Chinese had invented printing centuries before then. But suddenly in Europe, you can get your hands on a Bible. And also Martin Luther and his colleague in the Reformation, John Calvin, are able to use the printing press to disseminate hundreds of thousands of leaflets. And this starts to change the status quo in Europe. When Henry VIII decided that making use of this Reformation for his own ends, creating a Church of England, might be a good idea, well, the church that he created in the Church of England was basically quite Catholic in the way that it went about things, but he certainly raised his son, the future Edward VI, to be very Protestant. So we'll go with the Church of England being a Protestant church. When Henry VIII changes the state religion, he dissolves the monasteries. Now, this does have something to do with Agnes, because monasteries were not just a place of religious worship, they were also providers of health and education. When the monasteries were dissolved, unless you had plenty in your pocket, you could not see a physician. So within villages and communities, the role of looking after people's health, and especially of delivering babies, was quite often attributed to a so-called wise woman. And Agnes was one of those wise women. She was known as the wise wife of Keith. So this was a woman who would have had some knowledge in treating people with herbs, a sort of folk medicine, and whose skills were absolutely essential to the local community. But what she did was a little bit close to magic and to witchcraft in some people's view. And if you failed to heal someone, if someone died despite your ministrations, or a baby was born, stillborn, you could have been accused of witchcraft. So you're absolutely indispensable. Your skills are needed, but on the other hand, you're walking a fine line, and that is what happened to Agnes. So, in order to understand Agnes's life and what happened to her, we have to know a little bit about the man who tried her. It's very rare that a peasant woman would meet a king. That only comes about in exceptional circumstances. We need to know something about the particular king that she met. James Charles Stuart, who lived from 1566 to 1625. And he would go on to succeed Elizabeth I in 1603, as we mentioned, but he'd actually been King of Scotland since he was 13 months old, when his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, abdicated in his favour. Now, after he became King of England, he actually chose to live in England and only visited Scotland once, but at the time that we meet Agnes, he's still interested in what goes on in Scotland. We also mentioned the gunpowder plot, which was a plot by a group of disaffected Catholics who actually really were being repressed in society and losing rights. And they had a plot to blow up Parliament. Guy Fawkes, of course, famously implicated in that plot, but the ringleader was actually a guy called Robert Catesby. So they planned to blow up Parliament while James was in it. Of course, that didn't come off. Remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. And James was lucky to have escaped, but at the time he meets Agnes, this hasn't happened, but he still had other things happen in his life that cause him to be a little bit paranoid and to believe that people are out to get him. So, how did all that come about? Well, he's been King of Scotland since he was only 13 months old, and he's the kind of personality who was described by the politician Sir Anthony Weldon as the wisest fool in Christendom. He was responsible for the King James Bible. He also wrote a book called Demonology on how to spot demons, and he was very fascinated by all things witchcraft and evil, and he believed that that was actually a field of theology, a legitimate field of study. He's also famous for refusing to participate in religious wars. For example, he wouldn't get involved in the 30 Years' War that was sweeping Europe. So his mother was Mary Queen of Scots. His father was Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who was the second husband of Mary Queen of Scots. She had been married to the King of France at one point. They were Catholic, and the nobility in Scotland were Protestant, and that created a little bit of tension. It was a very unhappy marriage between James's parents, and it's going to be an unhappy marriage if, when you're 6 months pregnant, you witness your husband kill one of your best friends. And that's exactly what happened to Mary. Darnley had murdered her personal assistant, David Rizzio, in front of her eyes while she was 6 months pregnant. So that was not going to be a healthy relationship there. When James was eventually born, Elizabeth I was his godmother. The King of France and a Habsburg prince were his godfathers, so he was already an important figure in Europe. Now, none of these people actually came to his christening. They sent proxies, which turned out to be a good thing, because Mary Queen of Scots thought of her son as being a new King Arthur. He would be the heir to Elizabeth, and he would unite England and Scotland. So she has an Arthurian-themed christening, and that actually really offended the English people who were there. Now, James's father was murdered on the 10th of February 1567, and his mother was implicated in the murder, especially when soon after she married the Earl of Bothwell. She was then imprisoned by the Protestant nobility in Lochleven Castle and forced to abdicate in favour of James, then only 13 months old. So he's a baby and he's king. So who becomes his guardian and his regent is a really important thing in Scottish politics. Sadly, James never saw his mother again, although he was badly affected by her execution. James was very much raised as a Protestant within the Kirk, or the Church of Scotland. His tutor was quite mean to him, beat him regularly, even though he was a king. But despite that, James acquired a love of learning, and especially of literature. So when we look at his fascination with witchcraft, this is not coming from an ignorant, uneducated person. He's actually a very educated person. He was also raised to believe that monarchy had its limitations. Now, Mary escaped to England thinking that her fellow queen, Elizabeth I, would help her out. Of course, she didn't. She imprisoned her for 18 and a half years and then eventually executed her in 1587. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed for treason to Elizabeth I. She, of course, made the rather cogent argument that she couldn't have been a traitor to Elizabeth because she was not a subject of Elizabeth. Nonetheless, she had been implicated in a Catholic plot to execute Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, it said, was guilty about her execution for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, young James, growing up in Scotland, was thought to have had male lovers. I don't know if you've seen the TV series George and Mary recently, which alludes to James I's love life. Now, his first male lover was thought to have been his own cousin, Esme Stuart, who returned to Scotland from France when James was only 15, and James was quite smitten with him and made him the Duke of Lennox, the only duke in Scotland. So, in other words, he raises him above the rest of the nobility, and that ruffles a few feathers, as you can imagine. Scottish Calvinists saw him as wanting to, in their words, draw the king to carnal lust. This led to the so-called Ruthven Raid, where they imprisoned James. You know, I mentioned earlier on that James had several reasons to be paranoid. Well, here he finds himself imprisoned, and later on in his life he actually took power over the church, lest something like this happen to him again. Now, it so happened that James owed a lot of money to the family of the Earl of Gowrie, and in 1600 the Earl imprisons James. Alexander Ruthven, who was the younger brother of the Earl of Gowrie, gets into a fight with the king and actually assaults the king. Now, that's very, very serious, to assault God's anointed king. That is treason. So incensed was James's page, John Ramsay, that he ran Ruthven through and later became the first Earl of Holderness, by the way. The Earl of Gowrie, an important noble, was killed in the fracas that follows. So this is a major, major incident. Now, James continued to seem more interested in male company than in women, and his contemporaries actually praised his chastity because of this. But the point came where a king has to have a queen, he has to have an heir. So a suitable bride was found in Anne of Denmark, and a proxy wedding took place in Copenhagen in August 1589. Proxy as in not all the parties involved were actually there. It's like a remote wedding, but it was legally binding. So on her way to Scotland to meet her husband, Anne gets caught up in a storm, and this turns out to have quite a lot to do with Agnes later on, or it has an impact on Agnes. I know at the moment it doesn't seem related. But Anne is carried to the coast of Norway, and in what one commentator called the only romantic act of his life, James went to rescue her with 300 men. Now, he may have been gay, he may not have been. We don't know, we have no firm sources. But James does seem to have been quite kind to Anne, and they had a good relationship. They ended up having 3 children who survived childhood, including, of course, the ill-fated Charles I, who ended up being executed for opposing Parliament. So, on the 23rd of November 1589, the couple were formally married in the Bishop's Palace at Oslo, and Anne came with a pretty large dowry, so James was doing pretty well out of this marriage. While he's in Scandinavia, where they honeymooned, he is exposed to talk of witch trials. Witch trials were actually sweeping Europe at the time, and James develops a fascination with witchcraft at this point. And as we said earlier on, he considered this a legitimate form of theology, and he actually attended the first Scottish witch trials in North Berwick himself. The Witchcraft Act had actually been passed in 1563. So several defendants in North Berwick were convicted of sending storms against James's ship. There had been ladies who had confessed to sending storms against Anne's ship in Scandinavia, and this seems to be an extension, more and more people being made to pay for the bad weather that the royal couple had suffered. Now, one of the ladies accused in Scotland is Agnes Sampson, also known as the wise wife of Keith, but her confession had been made under torture, and James was willing to believe she was innocent and that this confession didn't really hold any water. And when we say torture, her body was found to have a mark on her genitalia, believed to have been left there by a sexual act with Satan, creating a pact with Satan. Now, Lucy Worsley describes this as sexual degradation. She also endured horrific physical pain. James decided to interview her himself because he's skeptical of the confession, and he has an open mind, or so we have reported to us. He was willing to believe she was innocent. But Agnes herself tells him he should believe that she's a witch. And then she tells him something absolutely unbelievable. And from then on, he's absolutely convinced that witches A exist and B are out to get him. Why does she do this? Well, that's what we're going to look at. Poor Agnes was garroted and then burned at the stake in January 1591. And then James went on to write his famous book Demonology, which actually provided the source material for the Weird Sisters in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Shakespeare, of course, wanting to suck up to James and to suck up to the new regime whenever James becomes King of England. And so, in a way, in our culture, we're still feeling Agnes's influence. So James, after this little episode with Agnes, personally oversees the torture of women in the Pendle witch trials. He became more sceptical of witchcraft after about 1599, when he wrote to his eldest son Henry, "Most miracles nowadays prove but illusions, and ye may see by this how wary judges should be in trusting accusations." But this was a little bit too late for Agnes. We mentioned before Agnes's position as a wise woman, or a wise wife. Wife just meaning woman, not necessarily married woman at the time. Now, in an article called The Knight and the Lion from the University of Aberdeen, we get a bit more of a description of what that involved. In a village, the wise woman or man often had knowledge which had been passed on from the generations before, and many years of experience working with herbs. Often the wise woman delivered babies too, and her skills were highly valued. In the earlier part of the Middle Ages, most people accepted magic and witchcraft, good and bad, as part of life. So at that point in history, the idea that someone could have supernatural powers was accepted as being real. In the 14th and 15th centuries, however, they were told that witches were the servants of the devil. So that brings in the idea that these kind of skills of the wise wife might have something evil behind them. Many wise women were accused of being witches and put to death. There were doctors too, of course, although they treated only the rich. So the kind of people that a wise woman would have come into contact with were poorer people in their local communities. And they mentioned before how open to accusation that they were. So how does Agnes become one of these women who's accused of witchcraft? Well, so Agnes lived in Netherkeith, which was a village forming part of a baronial estate. So you have an aristocratic landlord and everyone's paying rent to him, and that forms a community in the area. Her indictment tells us that she was a widow and that she had children. Now, in Denmark, women had confessed to using witchcraft to raise storms against Anne of Denmark, and James the Sixth of Scotland, and later First of England, was convinced he had been the victim of witchcraft in the storms he too had encountered. And following the Danish witch trials which he had seen, James decided to establish his own tribunal in Scotland. The accusations against Agnes are pretty much shrouded in rumour. We're not entirely sure how this all came about, but she was said to have been accused of making an image of the king for the devil to enchant to cause his death. The stories of the arrests and the trials and confessions of those accused in the North Berwick witch trials were printed in the News from Scotland in London in 1591. And so we know that Agnes had been accused by a lady called Gillis Duncan, who was actually on trial for witchcraft herself. She had been accused of witchcraft for being associated with Agnes, so that's a bit confusing. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation there. So Agnes is already thought of as a witch for Gillis to be thought of as a witch for associating with her, but she's the one who accuses Agnes. I find that quite confusing. I'm sure you might too as well. Now, Agnes had actually treated Gillis's husband, John Duncan, and by this stage, Gillis is Duncan's widow and known as Gillis Johnston. So could it be that whatever treatment that Agnes had given her husband hadn't worked and he had died? And did Gillis hold this against Agnes? We don't really know what happened between these two women. News from Scotland in 1591 describes the torture that Agnes endured after she was accused of witchcraft. This aforesaid Agnes Sampson, which was the elder witch, meaning that she was the oldest witch or possibly that she was the chief witch, was taken and brought to Holyrood Palace before the King's Majesty and sundry other of the nobility of Scotland. Now that would have been utterly terrifying because peasant women did not often have to appear before a king. It would have been so intimidating. Where she was straitly examined, but all the persuasions which the King's Majesty used to her with the rest of his council might not provoke or induce her to confess anything, but stood stiffly in the denial of all that was laid to her charge. So she is admitting nothing at this point. She is refusing to acknowledge any association with witchcraft, whereupon they caused her to be confined away to prison, there to receive such torture as hath been lately provided for witches in that country. And forasmuch as by due examination of witchcraft and witches in Scotland, it has lately been found that the devil does generally mark them with a privy mark, or a private mark, by reason the witches have confessed themselves that the devil doth lick them with his tongue in some private part of their body, before he doth receive them to be his servants, which mark commonly is given them under the hair in some part of their body, whereby it may not easily be found out or seen, although they be searched, and generally so long as the mark is not seen to those who search them, so long the parties that has the mark will never confess anything. Therefore, by special commandment, Agnes Sampson had all her hair shaven off in each part of her body. That is just so humiliating, it's vile. And her head thrawen, which means constricted, with a rope, according to the custom of that country, being a pain most grievous, which she continued almost an hour, during which time she would not confess anything until the devil's mark was found upon her privates. Then she immediately confessed whatsoever was demanded of her, and justifying those persons aforesaid to be notorious witches. So even though she's having her head squeezed with a rope and she's in agony, she still doesn't confess. But once they found this mark, I think Agnes would have known that was the end. She just couldn't argue against this mark that they'd found. And so she confesses and she implicates the other accused. Why does she do this? Maybe at this point she actually wanted to die, so horrendous was what was going on with her. Now, in the medieval period, they famously would have thrown a witch into water. If you floated, you were a witch, and if you were innocent, well, then you drowned. That's not how a witch is tried at this point in history, but this is arguably even more barbaric. And when you think about it, most of the women accused of witchcraft were not witches at all. This is not the persecution of a pagan religion. In fact, paganism wouldn't even have been seen as a religion by James VI of Scotland and his contemporaries. It was seen as a sort of evil practice. Religion meant one of two things at that time, Catholic or Protestant. This is an assault on women. You'll notice the sexual degradation of this and the idea that if a woman has power in her community, then it must come from an illegitimate source. So these trials, let's make no beef about it, these are an attack against women. And if you have something against a woman, you just need to accuse her of being a witch, and likely that's her taken out of your way. Now, men were also accused of witchcraft, but the vast majority of those accused of witchcraft and executed for it were women. So, under this incredible duress, Agnes confesses not just to raising a storm against the king, but to the storm that drowned Jane Kennedy, who had been a companion of
Mary, Queen of
who had
Scots.
died in 1589 when there was a collision between ferries in the River Forth. She said of the storm that James had experienced that it was a contrary wind to the rest of ships, then being in his company, which thing was most strange and true, as the King's Majesty acknowledges, for when the rest of the ships had a fair and good wind, then was the wind contrary and altogether against his Majesty. So there's a group of ships, James is in one of them, the other ships sail with no problem, but the weather goes against James's one ship, and that was seen as something really unusual and having a supernatural root to it. The Scottish notary public, David Moisey, had described James's trip to Norway and the storm that it began with in the Fife. And there actually had been other incidents of so called contrary winds in that area where several boats sailed and one was held back. So that actually was something that could legitimately happen. In December 1590, the English ambassador Robert Bowes described Agnes as having confessed to the king in person to having tried to obtain items of his clothing in order to cast charms on them. And according to Wikipedia, on the 27th of January, she confessed that the devil had offered to help her and her children because she was a poor widow. The devil appeared to her as a black man, a dog, or a hayrick. She had attended a witches' coven in North Berwick with her son in law, so why she implicates him, we do not know. They collected bones and powdered them for charms against the pains of childbirth, so that does sound pretty gruesome. Now, Samson described Bose as a little black and fat man with black hair, and she claimed that he had paid her to create a charm to render the king infertile. So, terrified, Bose retaliates that the description of his person was inaccurate, so she must be talking about someone else. Clearly, he didn't like being called black and fat, or little. Samson also claimed to have made a wax image of the father in law of a lady who had come to her wanting her father in law to be cursed. So, despite the fact the king was willing to believe her innocent, after she had confessed to all this, and that all this was confessed under duress, she does something pretty amazing. News from Scotland describes it like this. The said Agnes Sampson confessed before the King's Majesty sundry things that were so miraculous and strange as that His Majesty said they were all extreme liars. In other words, what she's confessing to is so out there it couldn't possibly be true. Whereat she answered, she would not wish His Majesty to suppose her words to be false, but rather to believe them, in that she would discover such matter unto him as His Majesty should not any way doubt of. And thereupon, taking His Majesty a little aside, she declared unto him the very words which passed between the King's Majesty and his Queen at Upslo or Oslo in Norway the first night of their marriage, with their answer each to other, whereat the King's Majesty wondered greatly, and swore by the living God that he believed that all the devils in hell could not have discovered the same, acknowledging her words to be most true, and therefore gave the more credit to the rest which is before declared. So Agnes takes the king aside, according to news from Scotland, and tells him about a private conversation he had had with his new wife on his honeymoon. This makes him completely believe that she's a witch. And now she's going to die, despite the fact that he had been willing to pardon her and believe she had confessed under duress. Why on earth does she do this? Now, do we actually believe this story? Was the News of London reporting this, knowing that one day that James would be King of England, and trying to make him appear merciful and rational by giving her a chance to explain herself, but she actually outs herself as a witch? Or did Agnes really say this to James? And if she did, why? Did someone give her this information that she then used to basically hang herself? Or was she so miserable with her life after the torture she had experienced, or perhaps so guilty by the other people who were going to be executed because of her confessions, that she decided to commit suicide in this way, but it was going to cause James to believe in witches and to keep killing people that he believed were witches. Why did Agnes do this if she did it? This is something that we just don't know. Of course, after this reported incident, James changed his mind and believed that Agnes was definitely guilty, and she was indicted on the 27th of January 1591. Then she was taken to a scaffold on Castle Hill in the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, and she was garroted and then burned at the stake on the 28th of January 1591. A public spectacle aimed at creating fear. And this paranoia that witches are out to get the king goes public. Now, Agnes was certainly not forgotten about. In November 2004, the New Scotsman referred to the rumours that Agnes's naked and tortured ghost still roams the palace at Holyrood House. And actually, in 2022, in the first episode of Lucy Worsley Investigates, Lucy Worsley tells the story of Agnes Sampson. So, Agnes's memory has not been lost, although we still don't know exactly what happened to her. There is, of course, in her story a cautionary tale for the rest of us about hysteria surrounding the power and authority of women, when the expertise of women is seen to be illegitimate and women have to cross that line in being indispensable to their communities, but also seen to be a threat to the established order of authority in those communities. When you have those ingredients in a situation, it normally doesn't turn out well.